Well, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you all. Welcome to the Stimson Center. My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO here at Stimson, and it's nice to see such a crowded room for our guest here today. In the face of the hyperpartisanship that has enveloped this town over the course of the past many, many years, it is, I think, easy to forget that every morning the vast preponderance of government officials that represent us get up and do the nation's business. And that, I think, is a spirit that we deeply value here at Stimson, and it's one as well that I think describes our guest of honor here today, someone who gets up not motivated by partisanship, but motivated by doing what is right and in support of U.S. security here at home and around the world. Not only is he the most famous bow tie in Washington, D.C., but Chris brings to the position of Assistant Secretary of International Security and Nonproliferation a deep pedigree on these issues. He previously served at the White House as Senior Director of WMD, managing the WMD file. He served in a variety of positions on Capitol Hill. He has served in the think tank community, not the Stimson Center. Nobody's perfect, Chris. But again, and indeed also as an intelligence officer in the Naval Reserve. So this guy brings, again, a long and distinguished career of public service, and we are grateful to him for that, and also for offering to come and join us for a conversation here today. Here's the order of battle. We're going to give Chris a few minutes to make some framing remarks, and then he will join me here on stage. We'll ask him a few questions, and then we'll turn it over to you as well, and give you the opportunity to offer any questions that you might have for the Assistant Secretary. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Assistant Secretary Ford. Welcome. Well done.
Well, the button has gone green.
Well
I think
done.
that means the mic is on. And I will, well, this is not a level surface, so I'll take my cup and display it properly. And I'll put it over here. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, and thank you for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, not only because it is my first time in the building, but also because being here gives me a chance to talk about some of the things that we are doing in the nonproliferation programming business in the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation. Now, for those of you familiar with the ISN Bureau, you will know that our mission, our principal mission, is to deter, contain, limit, and roll back the threats that are presented by the acquisition of weapons of mass destruction, related materials and technologies, delivery systems, and advanced conventional weapons by either state or non-state actors. Now, these are, of course, enormously important issues. We remain ferociously dedicated to this mission. But while these responsibilities remain both urgent and extremely important, I also wanted to flag that we are building out our roles and responsibilities in the U.S. system in a little bit in certain ways that better advance, we hope will better advance U.S. national security and foreign policy objectives in a broader sense. We are trying to do more with our skills and skill set, not only to focus upon proliferation and terrorism threats, but also upon the imperatives of restoring U.S. geopolitical competitiveness in the broadest sense against rival powers, for example, after a generation in which, I'm sorry to say, I think we forgot about the importance of that kind of competitive strategy. So we're trying to do more in that respect as well. And those two aspects of our work are ones of enormous importance to us and to which we're greatly dedicated. But I want to flag a third lobe of what we are up to in the nonproliferation business today. And that is what we are doing with respect to re-envisioning how our nonproliferation programming works. Foreign assistance, of course, has traditionally been a core mission of the Department of State. But of course, budgets are always tight, and the threats facing the United States and its partners and friends and allies are multiple and complex. We want to make sure that the U.S. taxpayer gets the best bang for the buck from funds that are devoted to overseas programming. And we want all Americans to know that the U.S. government is allocating assistance money as effectively as possible to meet the most important threats and challenges that face us in the world. So at ISN, We are working to meet this particular challenge head on, and we are in the process of reforming our nonproliferation assistance programs in light of the twin imperatives of making sure that threat-based prioritization occurs and that programmatic effectiveness is achieved. And I'd like to tell you about this effort today. So this is an important reform effort, in part because we actually do run quite a bit of programming, something on the order of $250 million a year in this funding. We use this money to engage with governments and industries around the world in many ways through capacity building assistance, for example, that helps other countries be better partners with us in combating the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, delivery systems, and all the things I mentioned before. We help other countries do such things as train and equip their border guards and security forces against proliferation threats. We develop and we implement sound export control and technology transfer regulatory regimes. We help them secure their borders against nuclear smuggling. We implement nuclear safeguards. We enforce UN sanctions against rogue regimes such as North Korea and Iran, and we help others enforce those sanctions. And we equip first responders to deal with WMD use, if God forbid it should occur. Our engagements with foreign partners, moreover, go beyond just traditional government-on-government engagements and employ implementers from international organizations, U.S. and foreign think tanks, the U.S. national labs, and academic institutions alike. By way of example, within ISN, the Office of Cooperative Threat Reduction seeks to mitigate the risk of irresponsible use of and access to WMD, and it works to prevent proliferator states and terrorist groups from developing or acquiring WMD and delivery systems to attack the U.S. homeland or U.S. interests. It works closely with partner countries to enforce UN Security Council resolutions and builds partner country capacities to cut off resources that proliferator regimes rely upon to advance their threat programs. The Office of Export Control Cooperation administers the EXBIS program, the Export Control and Related Border Security Program, which trains border security personnel and law enforcement officials around the world to detect, to interdict, investigate, and prosecute illicit transfers of such items, and to ensure that international ports of entry, such as seaports and airports, for example, have adequate equipment and training to interdict or screen, as necessary, suspicious cargo. EXBIS assists partner countries in establishing strategic trade controls to regulate the transfer of technologies and material that could be used for all of these threat programs, and to strengthen compliance with international strategic trade control norms and UN sanctions resolution. EXBIS also conducts outreach to the private sector to help industry better understand its own obligations in these respects. Our Office of Weapons of Mass Destruction Terrorism works with foreign partners to establish, strengthen, and maintain capabilities to detect, defeat, prevent, and respond to terrorist attempts to smuggle or acquire various types of dangerous things, chemical, biological, radioactive, or nuclear materials. This office also works multilaterally to advance these capabilities, including through things such as the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism. And last but not least, our Nonproliferation and Disarmament Fund is a sort of a special projects fund that's used primarily to address urgent nonproliferation needs, such as dismantling nuclear facilities, destroying missiles, and addressing chemical weapons used by the Assad regime. So taken together, this is an enormously important bundle of existing programming. It's a multi-pronged effort that we use to help partner governments keep potentially dangerous technologies out of the hands of proliferators or terrorists by creating effective proliferation barriers at the facility level, at the institutional level, at the national level, and at the multilateral level. Our programs help, in effect, therefore, create what is, in effect, a layered defense against the flow and movement of weapons, WMD, materials, and expertise. But that's not all that we do. We can't rest on our laurels in this, and because money doesn't grow on trees, we must ensure that the programming that we do meets the challenges that I mentioned earlier. Specifically, we need to make sure that our programming is always targeted as effectively as possible at the most urgent threats. It's been some time since there was a bottom-up review of the State Department's nonproliferation programming. But in our view, if we are to be good stewards of the U.S. taxpayers' money and of the national security interests of all Americans, we need to be willing to keep our programming model up to date so that it is as relevant as possible in light of changing circumstances. And so, as a result of this, I've directed, and we are currently implementing, a review of our programming with this objective in mind. It's been underway for some months. This is not a new thing. But one of the results already has been a new initiative to explore how we use our capacity-building skills to help foreign partners resist the depredations of powers seeking to acquire Western technology for military uses in support of their own revisionist agendas that may threaten to destabilize entire regions of the globe. But more broadly, And in keeping with the assumption that because resources are finite and life is short, we should seek engagement with foreign partners not for its own sake, but rather to achieve clear improvements in U.S. national security, I've directed that ISN reassess its programming from the ground up in order to ensure that it really does focus upon the highest priority threats. To address these complex challenges, we have initiated a restructuring of ISN nonproliferation assistance and capacity building in order to help the ISN team have greater flexibility in our use of limited assistance funding in order to achieve maximum impact on the ground. So one of our watch phrases in doing this is to focus upon national security priorities. And we are emphasizing this in key areas that I'll put up the extended dance mix of my remarks on our website because I don't want to bore you with all of the inside baseball stuff, but suffice it to say that we are making sure that we reassess programming to make sure that it is narrowly targeted upon high priority items as understood from documents such as the National Security Strategy. These priorities apply across the Bureau, not just in our programming offices, but it's important to remember that we are asking that a demonstrable connection to one of these particular high priority needs be shown, and that proposed initiatives need, in effect, to compete with one another, so that as we implement these reforms, U.S. leaders and the American people can have confidence that the marginal nonproliferation dollar is always being used against the greatest unmet need. Another watchword is coordination. For despite the inherent complementarity of a lot of what we do in ISN and its program offices and its policy offices, the efforts of our programming have in the past sometimes lacked integration between the programming side and the policy office side. So to help address this, we are breaking down barriers between the policy and the programmatic side in order to ensure that we are as effective as possible across the range of our endeavors. In support of the top priority that Secretary Pompeo has placed, for instance, upon supporting the President's pressure campaign against North Korea in order to constrain the development of its threat programs and lay the development for what we hope and expect will be a negotiated denuclearization, our CTR office, for instance, has shifted its focus more upon activities that build partner capacities, I should say, to cut off resources used by proliferator regimes. I alluded to this a moment ago. The ECC office has similarly expanded border security programming, specifically to focus upon the threat of WMD terrorism, such as by providing inspection equipment and border security help to places like Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, and to help Egyptian authorities with their own investigative tools as they address threats of terrorism inside their borders as well. The WMDT office is expanding its work from just the nuclear arena to cover a wider range of across the CBRN space, the chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear space, to make sure that we work as effectively as possible to help shore up and close gaps in partner countries' capabilities in those regards as well. An additional area of emphasis, threat-based prioritization, which I alluded to before. How funding is managed in our non-pro funding, in our programming work. We inherited a system in which non-proliferation programming was largely managed in country-specific stovepipes, between which it was very difficult to move money, even in response to pressing needs in a complex and evolving international security environment. In fact, at the moment, most of EXPIS's budget is currently contained within 55 separate bilateral accounts and 5 regional accounts, a structure which generally requires that EXPIS spend such funds only within that particular stovepipe. Now, in my view, this system was too rigid and too inflexible to meet contemporary needs. It may have been a fine answer at a time when the policy priority was in effect to reach our arms around as many international partners as possible, perhaps largely for its own sake. But it is not enough, in my view, for those of us who are more focused upon ensuring that finite foreign assistance resources are targeted as effectively as possible against a all too not finite range of national security threats. So as part of our work in reforming how we do our non-pro programming, and after extensive consultation with regional bureaus at the department, with other U.S. government agencies, and of course our international partners as well, we are working with the State Department's Office of Foreign Assistance Resources, which we know colloquially in the building as F. It's like bond with Q and M and stuff, right? We're working with F to realign the kaleidoscope of our funding stovepipes. When this multi-year transition is complete, we will be far more able to maximize our effectiveness by ensuring that ISN is always directing each non-proliferation programming dollar to the highest priority unaddressed need. Now, we do this in a couple of ways. In support of this, our ECC office has developed a threat prioritization index, which ranks all 67 of EXPIS's current partner countries based upon the WMD proliferation risks with which these countries are associated, their capabilities to mitigate those risks, and the strategic trade pathways within each country. which are, of course, the potential ways in which things might move illicitly and dangerously. This in-house threat prioritization matrix, which incorporates input from the U.S. intelligence community and open sources as well, underpins how it is that we're approaching our XBIS realignment. This matrix is designed to help us evaluate potential threat reduction effectiveness of actual or potential programs, allowing effort to be focused where it is most needed and money to be saved where it is not. With help from the Sandia National Laboratory, moreover, we are expanding this threat matrix from covering just XBIS's current partners to covering the entire world, so that it can, in time, serve as a much more effective targeting algorithm, if that's the right word, to help guide our programming efforts to direct our money to the most acute needs in the years ahead. In countries where the matrix suggests that we face lower threat levels, and so far this means principally South and Eastern Europe, ECC plans to wrap up its current programming efforts on an expedited timeline and to shift local assets or facilities to host country ownership by the end of fiscal year 2019. As those local programs wind down, XBIS will continue to provide limited technical assistance to ensure sustainability, but it will eliminate support to lower threat countries as the program mission is accomplished there, and it will shift financial and personnel resources to higher threat areas. This move, in the aggregate, will allow XBIS to realign close to $10 million in fiscal 2018 bilateral funding alone, from country-specific to global or to regional accounts, thereby making it available to help address more urgent threats. As our efforts continue and mature, XBIS aims to roughly double its centrally managed account and to triple its regional accounts by realigning funds from bilateral allocations. So we're going from the country-specific stovepipe model to a much more broadly aggregated model that is capable of addressing emerging and changing threats as time goes by. And over time, we think this will allow us to ensure that threat-prioritized programming occurs on an ongoing basis, not only directing resources where they are most needed, but also being able quickly to respond effectively to evolving threats and to engage new partners as circumstances require in this complex world of ours. Now, placing more emphasis upon ensuring that we continue any given program only for so long as it remains necessary also means that we'll have to give more thought to concepts of graduating partners in our program efforts and to improving program evaluation through more effective performance metrics. Our WMDT office, for instance, has already transitioned 2 of its bilateral partners to what is called an advanced partner status, indicating that these countries have now, with our help over several years, they have developed a solid indigenous capability to prevent, detect, and respond to nuclear and other radioactive materials smuggling. These advanced partners can now assist us with training efforts in their region of the world and serve as mentors to other countries that are not so far along that continuum. This allows us to use our outlays more effectively against the greatest unmet needs while still continuing to address threats in the original region by leveraging the partner expertise that we ourselves have helped create, using it then as a catalyst to improve the capabilities of other countries. Now, with regard to performance metrics, I fully acknowledge that it can be challenging to know to what degree one is making a dent in a problem such as nuclear smuggling, for example. It is precisely the purpose of so much of what we do in the nonproliferation programming world to keep bad things from happening. And illicit movements of WMD facilitating technology and materials, delivery systems, and advanced conventional weapons are not so common that you can sort of do trend lines that one could in other areas of commodities, for example. So if you see nothing untoward happening in a proliferation sense, is this happening at a particular border crossing, for example? Does that mean that you have deterred by virtue of making it a harder target? Have you deterred activity that would otherwise have taken place? Or have you simply misunderstood the problem in the first place and you've wasted your time? You should have been doing it over here. This is a hard thing to assess, and we are building more and more sophisticated ways to address this. But we don't think it's impossible to have performance metrics here at all. It is certainly possible to tell on a before or an after basis whether local capabilities have, in fact, improved, and the degree to which international best practices are being followed. We are improving our longstanding methodology for assessing these things and finding better ways to make sure that our programming remains as effectively targeted as possible. The current methodology does not offer a comprehensive framework for evaluating these kinds of things, but we will do better, and our ISN team is working to ensure that this is done as quickly as possible. Now, as I say, I'll be putting more of the full details of all this in the written remarks, but I did want to stress, make sure you guys got the main point, and that is that nonproliferation assistance programs are absolutely critical tools for advancing U.S. national security interests, for promoting our values, for securing international peace and security. And in this respect, we have a proud legacy to uphold. but we can do better, and we will. And our work to reform nonproliferation programming along the lines that I have suggested here today is helping make this possible. I brought with me today some of the experts who are actually doing this and making this happen in the real world. I get to sort of stand back and tell them to do it, and they're the ones who get the real credit for making this possible and for moving it forward, and they will also be able to help me answer any tough questions that you guys have for me today. But it's a delight to be able to explain this aspect of what we are doing. It is something that often gets lost in the shuffle when headlines focus upon the high-priority crisis du jour. But remember that these programming efforts are underway all the time, every day, across dozens and dozens of countries around the world. We are working very hard and in very concrete ways to make the world a safer place, and we are improving how it is that we attempt to do that even better in the future. And I'm glad to have the chance to explain some of this to you, and would be happy to take any questions that you may have. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks once again for your hospitality. Great. Far chair? Sure thing. I'll take my my branding logo tee.
Well, Chris, thanks so much for that. Obviously, you've set us up for, I think, a rich discussion, and I know that folks here want to get in as quickly as possible, and I'm going to let them do that. But first, let me just fire a couple at you that occurred to me. I mean, we've all, and I suspect you as well, have been watching the discussions up at the General Assembly pretty closely today. The President spoke this morning, and one of the subjects that he broached, of course, was foreign assistance, and he referred in that speech to Secretary Pompeo's, your boss's, review of U.S. foreign assistance writ large, and described that review, or the output of that review at least, as having greater focus on foreign assistance going to America's friends. So can you give us a sense of what that means, and how does that impact your own review of our national security investments in these programs? I mean, in Canada, is Canada friend in my own interest? And if you think about it long enough, you'll know why I'm asking that.
I will let the president speak for himself. He was quite clear that Secretary Pompeo is heading up a look, as the president described it, a hard look at U.S. foreign assistance to examine what is working, what is not working, and whether the countries who receive our dollars and our protection also have our interests at heart. To me, that is a fancy way of saying that we need to make sure that we keep our eye focused resolutely upon the effectiveness of the programs that we administer, and to make sure that they are, in fact, the effectiveness in the broadest sense, so that we work with partners who are good partners, and that's certainly already a part of our nonproliferation programming. Insofar as you might think of, this is not my phrase. I freely disclaim authorship of it, but I heard someone the other day refer to thinking about potential nonproliferation programming partners as being falling into three, maybe not completely exclusive bundles. There's the unaware, who don't know that there's an issue or there's a problem, and with whom one can work very productively to raise awareness and draw attention to the important needs of things like making sure that counter-nuclear smuggling work is done, that the borders are secure against potential smuggling pathways and this kind of thing. Make them aware of the fact that there are UN Security Council resolutions that they actually have some responsibilities to uphold, that there are resolutions in place, not just with respect to stopping proliferation to rogue regimes like North Korea, but with regard to ensuring that non-state actors don't get their hands on weapons of mass destruction. One can raise awareness and engage with partners and to help address the sort of category one, the unaware. There's also the unable. There may be countries who, even if perfectly well aware of the problem and indeed committed to do it, have capacity challenges, and that's one of the things in which we at ISN essentially specialize in. We are capacity builders in the nonproliferation business in many of the ways that I was just describing, and we're working very hard to make that programming more effective and more targeted and more prioritized, to make sure that we are able to show to the powers that be that we are living up to our responsibilities as stewards of the American people's, the American taxpayers' money and the American people's national security interests, that we can actually provide value added where we program. But against those who are unable, we can help. Then there's the unwilling category. So if you've got the unaware, the unable, and the unwilling. There may be those who are perfectly capable of doing exactly what they should be doing, but who aren't willing to. And there's a degree to which one can engage with them to arm twist and cajole or if necessary, sanction. And we, of course, do those things as well. But these are sort of the three conceptual categories of partner countries. What I read the President's exhortation here is to make sure that we do all of those types of things smart. And Secretary Pompeo, as he indicated, will be heading up a broad review of assistance programs, about which I cannot speak today. I only know one little piece of this, but I can assure you that in the non-proliferation programming world, we are already deeply into what I think is a very serious review indeed, that we're very pleased with the results that it's starting to bring about. And we've gotten very good support from the State Department hierarchy. I mentioned our work with F to realign from country-specific stovepipes to larger bundles of money that can more effectively target needs as we understand them and allow for greater threat prioritization across the spectrum of our programming efforts. So we are certainly very supportive of this effort, and we will work very closely. We'll certainly work very closely with my boss in supportive as however it is useful for us to do that. But we're actually excited by the opportunities that this presents, and we think that at the end of the day, our non-proliferation programming will look pretty darn good.
So let me ask you a completely unfair question. Let's focus on your piece of this, Chris, and ask you to try to project forward. When we on the outside oftentimes try to assess the effectiveness, and you made this comment, not in so many words, it's difficult, right, to assess the effectiveness of these programs in many ways because we're trying to prove a negative, right? We're trying to say, well, nothing happened. We were successful. And so oftentimes we on the outside, members of the media, we look at it and we try to judge an administration's seriousness vis-a-vis these programs by looking at, well, what's the budget number? How much did they spend? So if you try to project forward, do you see implications for the budget at the end of this review, or give us a little bit of a sense as to what that might look like?
Well, these are ongoing discussions, as you might imagine, and it would be wrong to speculate about potential budget impact at this point, except that one thing I think we can be quite comfortable with, and that is that our objective is to ensure that whatever the dollar amount allocated to these programs, that we will be getting more for it. We're getting more for it now than a year ago. We'll get more for it in a year's time, and so forth. So I'll leave the bigger picture budget machinations to those who do that for a living. Our job is to execute and to do as good a job with what we're given, and we're working real hard to make sure it's done fantastically well.
And tell me this. So as you think about, it's never too soon to think about legacy, Chris. Though you've got 6 more years.
What are you trying to tell me?
You've got 6 more years, but still. If we think back to this file, sort of that the non-proliferation space, we think post-Cold War, President Clinton and his administration really innovated a lot of these programs, these legacy programs that your colleagues, who have terrible jobs, by the way, and operate in oftentimes really unpleasant places, just doing the Lord's work. And I'm glad you gave a shout out to them because they really do remarkable work around the planet for us.
They do.
We move on to President Bush. President Bush really, I think, helped reset in many ways and build new norms in terms of kind of reaching out beyond U.S. programming. So UN Security Council Resolution 1540, the advent of the Global Partnership, which is this quite remarkable burden-sharing effort of other countries around the world, and U.S. encouragement to gain more partners in that domain. The Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, and so on, and so Proliferation Security Initiative, and so forth. President Obama comes in with his own stamp, launches the Nuclear Security Summit process that essentially pulls world leaders together in a quite high-profile way to focus both political as well as practical attention on these issues. What is going to be the legacy of the Trump administration?
I'm not a prophet, so take this for what it's worth. My hope is, in this particular arena, I mean, there are lots of things, of course, one could point to, and we are, of course, very focused on giving the President and Secretary Pompeo the support that they need to bring the long-festering North Korean situation to a conclusion in a negotiated way, as promised in Singapore, and as we hope to be able to execute against in implementing a negotiated deal. That's a major legacy. We are trying, as the Secretary of State indicated back in May at Heritage Foundation, we are working very hard to put the squeeze on the Iranians right now to make them, to constrain their ability to continue the malign acts that they've done all around their region and to some degree around the world as well. and incentivize them to reach the kind of broader, more comprehensive deal that the Secretary outlined back in May. Those will be, we hope, enormously those will be the overshadowing, front page headlines. Even the sort of, the elementary school students know that we did that. That's sort of the, inshallah, that'll be our answer there. But in this particular realm, in the nonproliferation programming business, I would like us to be remembered as the folks that took this long and important and valuable succession of high-level interventions, whether it's the Security Council setting a new global norm with Resolution 1540, or the Nuclear Security Summit process, bringing heads of state together on multiple occasions to give commitments to moving nuclear security issues forward. Took that legacy of high-level commitments and institutionalized all of that into the everyday muscle memory of how it is that we all go about living in a complicated WMD potential, a world of WMD potential. It's great to make promises at summits, and to the degree that having a summit can elicit those kinds of pledges from senior leaders and foreign partners, fantastic. But making a promise, as we all know, alas, from our day-to-day life, is not always the same thing as keeping that promise. And in order for it to be kept right, habits of good security, whether it's in the export control business or the nuclear security business or whatever it may be, need to be built into the day-to-day activity of how it is that bureaucrats, industrial people in the industrial sector, academicians worrying about technology control issues. There's a whole range of issues where we have to build a shared security culture, and we have to make good security practices best practices as we, and this is the ultimate example of capacity building, right? We need to help people get to the point where good security practices on all these areas are as natural and as habitual as breathing is itself to everyday people. You don't think about breathing, but if you don't do it, you die. We want good security practices and the norms of what we are trying to build out in all these areas to be as natural as that. And if we can be remembered as the people who got the global community on a path to that kind of institutionalization and deep reptilian brain muscle memory, that's fantastic. I would love to be remembered for that.
Can you talk a little bit, Chris, about your efforts, your day-to-day efforts, to kind of build and reinforce the global coalition? So of our friends and allies abroad who are focused on this issue as well, give me a sense of what that looks like for you. What is the administration doing to kind of pull that cohort together, get them focused on a common mission?
Well, there's nothing terribly complicated about it. It's complicated only in the sense that there are a million moving pieces. It is a series of engagements all the way from the working level, where there's it could be doing pull-out training for officials in some conflict-ridden country where it's maybe even too dangerous for U.S. officials to go there directly. We bring them out, train them in some other place to get to improve their skills. It's engagements with the national labs to make sure that the right technology is provided to help do things like, scan for illicit materials at a border. It is those kind of working level, way down in the weeds engagements, all the way up to very senior back and forth between officials at my level and higher, when we engage with foreign counterparts and remain sort of, what's the phrase from the Security Council? Remain seized with the question, right? We need to make sure that the high-level people remain seized with these questions, that they are a part of everyday diplomatic intercourse, as well as everyday programmatic attention with bureaucracies trying to do better. Making, as I indicated before, it is engagement with the private sector and the academic world to make sure that these issues remain ones of continued importance. And if we can do all of these things sort of at the same time and continue doing them and make this part of the sort of the mantra invocation on a daily basis, we've got a fighting chance of helping build that security culture. But there's not a magic recipe, and that's one of the challenges of the kind of institutionalization that I was talking about. This is not something where you sort of get up and have a conference and say, okay, we've decided to institutionalize this. The only way you do it is to do it, and that's the sort of journey of 1,000 leagues begins with a single step approach. And I don't want that to sound cliched, but there really isn't a magic solution here. There is the results of day-to-day sweat and elbow grease and just continued engagement and pushing up against what needs to be done to ensure that it is. And we just got to keep doing it.
Is your job any harder? Is that job any harder because of the kind of political tumult that we are seeing on the international stage, whether it's vis-a-vis our NATO partners, on other issues entirely? Do you see kind of a common collaborative spirit with our allies still, or has that become more complicated?
my perspective only goes back to January in this job, so I don't have a lot of comparison basis. But I have been struck by the degree to which this isn't a problem, in the sense that, I mean, I suppose I felt this when I was at the NSC about these issues, and I feel this now. I'm actually sort of blessed that so much of what we do and what I've been having the honor to be involved with isn't something that is, okay, I worked on JCPOA stuff, got it. So there have clearly been issues I've been working on a lot that have, that draw the kind of high-level static of the policy community. But most of the things that I'm talking about here today are ones that have been an enduring policy priority and a budgetary priority for multiple administrations and continue to retain support across both sides of the aisle here in Washington. That's a blessing. That means we can actually keep doing this day-to-day slog. I fear that if it became politicized, these kinds of issues, well, the kind of day-to-day slog of continued engagement and the mantra piece of pushing forward on these things at a million different levels simultaneously, if we didn't have that enduring support, that would be extraordinarily hard. So that would be a very dangerous thing, I think, if these issues became politicized. But they haven't been, and we're very lucky to be able to have the kind of continued support that we need to keep doing that stuff and keeping at that day-to-day, nose to the grindstone effort that I don't do so much of as these fantastic people who work in the Bureau do. But so far it's all right.
So you mentioned two countries that if I don't ask you a question on, I'm going to be booed off the stage. So let me beat this.
I'd like to see that, actually.
It's happened many times. It's happened many times before. You need to spend more time here, clearly, Chris. So let's start with Iran. So the president painted a pretty grim picture from the dais up in New York of a murderous regime in Tehran. We're now outside the JCPOA. The specter of secondary sanctions is in the offing. Are we better off now than we were within the JCPOA?
Well, yes, and we're better off still when this plan hopefully succeeds in incentivizing an Iranian return to the table to reach not just a deal that kicks the can temporarily down the road on the nuclear file and leaves many other issues unaddressed, but one that actually provides an answer to restraining Iran's capabilities in ways that deny it the capability to do just the sort of thing it appears to have been contemplating when it essentially shrink-wrapped all the legacy data from its nuclear weapons program and put it on a shelf in a warehouse for a rainy day. That just illustrates the problem that we are trying to solve. But our hope is that by turning the pressure back onto the Iranian regime and confronting it with the choice of a very painful, indefinite future of feeling that sort of pressure, on the one hand, or coming back to us and reaching and working to reach the kind of goal that Secretary Pompeo announced back in May as being our objective, we hope that they'll make the right choice and that the ultimate result will be one that in fact vindicates all of this and shows that indeed this is a better way to approach meeting these challenges. I'm sure, well, it was very striking to me in our own negotiations with people up until the point, and since, that we left the JCPOA, the degree to which, although there were, of course, differences in tactics, there was a remarkable agreement, particularly with our European friends, on the nature of the threats that we needed to somehow address together. We all agreed that Iran's missile proliferation has been a regional catastrophe. Its destabilization of its neighbors has been horrific and deeply problematic. Its support for terrorism is completely unacceptable. And we also all agreed that it would be a terrible idea for Iran to build up the kind of enormous nuclear capacities, fissile material production capacities, on-hand stocks of enriched material, that the JCPOA would have permitted Iran to do in some years' time. To have all of this going on at the same time, no one thought that was a good idea. And although we clearly didn't have exactly the same perspective on exactly what to do about it and when to do that doing, I think that fundamental agreement upon the threat is real, and it means that when we get the Iranians back into the business of talking about a better solution, that we'll have a lot of diplomatic support and partners with us to insist that that solution be a meaningful one in ways that we collectively were not able to achieve in 2015. But I do think we can do better, and I think we will.
Where do you think the Iranians go from here on out? What are the next steps that you anticipate from Tehran?
I would hesitate to put myself in their shoes. I don't know exactly what their next steps will be. I like to think, and I hope, and I believe it's true, that there are quite a few international partners around the world, even those who are very sympathetic to the Iranians from the perspective of being unhappy with us for getting out of the deal. But I do think that even across that space, there are a great many folks who are also telling the Iranians that even though you are unhappy with what the Americans have done here, it is really, really important for you to stay within those nuclear limits and for you not to cut back access and monitoring by the IAEA, because it is that upon which the international community's confidence in Iran's peaceful intentions depend. And if that access and if those limits were to evaporate, this would be a profound turning point in swinging. Nothing could be better. Nothing you could imagine on the Iranian side would be better calibrated to ensure that everyone comes over to the American side on this particular issue than them forsaking those limits and or cutting back IAEA access. And I hope and think that partners around the world are making that very darn clear to the Iranians. And also that when the IAEA does come, if ever it, if the circumstances transpire that the IAEA shows up at their door asking for access to something or other after using the agency's professional judgment to decide what needs to be visited in order for it to fulfill its mandate in Iran, there's only one acceptable answer from the Iranian side in response to such a request, and that, of course, is yes. We hope that the message is being given by others, and we think it is to the Iranians, and it is a true message and an important one. And I think at the end of the day, we're going to end up having a pretty good diplomatic coalition in support of a better deal.
So let's turn just briefly to North Korea, and then we'll open it up here, Chris. I think that there are some, unfortunately, that are loathed to give the president, the administration, credit for almost anything. But if we had to look at what has transpired in North Korea, I think we have to say, look, that clearly Pyongyang has made at least some tentative steps towards confidence building in this domain, but they clearly want more. And we assume, most notably, they want an end to the formal conflict, right? They want a peace treaty. Can you give me a sense of what the administration's thinking is in this space? Is that something that is on the table? Are we close? What more can we give to gain the sort of continued reciprocity that that Kim even called for, as late as last week in the summit with President Moon?
I think the best answer is to let Steve Biegun and the Secretary's working group speak for themselves to the degree that they're willing to do so. We play a role in my bureau in supporting all of those efforts. We support those efforts in multiple ways. We are, of course, working, as we have been for a long time, to keep the pressure on the North Korean regime. I mentioned our partnership capacity building. One of the things that we have been doing is finding countries that are in the aware but unable business and moving them into the both aware and able business. We work with them to build their capacity. We work with diplomatic engagements around the world in a whole bunch of different ways to try to make sure that the pressure remains on. That supports the effort, of course, in making sure that the North Koreans continue to feel the incentive to implement the promises that they made in Singapore. We work to support with nonproliferation expertise as the U.S. interagency plans for what it might be possible and desirable to, in fact, do if the answer is yes. We've been saying for months now that we don't want to be the dog that chases the car for months and months, and all of a sudden the car screeches to a stop. You don't want to be sort of standing there going, oh my God, what do I do with this car? So there's an interagency planning effort that's been underway for some time to be ready at such point as the North Koreans agree to implement the denuclearization promises that they've already made. So we're supporting those efforts as well. But in terms of where things go next, I hope you'll appreciate that the diplomacy is sensitive enough. It is very difficult to speak of really at all. And I think the better folks to whom to address that question about exactly what the next steps would be is probably the Secretary's working group.
So can you imagine an EXPIS program in DPRK?
I would love over time to get to the point where North Korea is a normal enough country in its behavior and in the threats that it presents, or in fact doesn't present, that those kinds of things would be normal. I have no idea how they approach export controls. I mean, my impression so far over the years has been that they absolutely love to export dangerous things. If that's the frame that they bring to being a normal country, we have a lot of work to do there, and we'll be happy to do it.
Very good. All right, so let me open it up, and I'd like to ask members of the press first if you have questions. If you could identify yourself. We have microphones that will come around to you, and if you don't speak up quickly, I am going to move on quickly. Sir, if you would just be so kind as well, just to identify yourself for the benefit of our speaker as well.
I'm Mike Stone from Reuters, and the question has to do with anticipating the needs of partners. In the current posture, what's the level of anticipation? And in the redesigned posture, is there a move to anticipate the needs and from a, I won't want to say like top down, but say
collecting or?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, let me just murmur a couple because I know that there are going to be.
I love it when he says that. It's hilarious.
That just slipped out.
And only some of you get it. The chuckles are appreciated. So.
Any other questions that you want to collect with this? Well, ma'am, we'll go right here, and then this gentleman here in the blue tie. I think I recognize you.
Thank you. Eva Kovacheva with Mainichi Newspapers from Japan. Now, we have heard that the Pentagon plans to release the Missile Defense Review within a few weeks, hopefully, and it will focus on not only ballistic missiles, but also cruise missiles and hypersonic weapons. So for many years, the U.S. insisted that missile defense systems are focused only on North Korea and Iran's ballistic missiles, not on Russia and China. Now, going forward, there will be only 3 countries, the U.S., Russia, and China, that are getting hypersonic weapons. So experts say that the U.S. will use missile defense systems to counter the Russian and Chinese hypersonic weapons threat. Is this a policy change on the U.S. side? Russia and China may see it this way and may accuse the U.S. of targeting them. So how do you manage the situation? And also going forward, are there any plans to start talking with Russia and China about hypersonic weapons?
Chris, hold on. If you would just hand it to Chris right there. Do you want to take one more, or
sure,
do you want to try to do it? Do you want to take one more? Chris, please.
Thank you. Chris Bidwell from the Federation of American Scientists. Thank you for a great presentation, Chris. My question is this with a subpart. Supposing peace breaks out all over the world, deals get made, and suddenly Iran and North Korea are amenable to stopping their programs, are there preparations being made as to how we might deal with verification of their compliance, how that might play out? And kind of related to that, based on what you said earlier, you talked about re-engineering or reimagining programmatics within State Department. Is that something you can do, or will that require Congress? In other words, if money is appropriated for country X, Y, and Z, how hard can you move that yourself, or is that going to take an act of Congress to do? Thank you.
Good questions. Thanks, Chris.
Okay. The easiest one to answer is, I'm sorry to say, on the MDR, because I'm not in a position to comment on a report that hasn't come out yet. So perhaps that's a discussion you can raise with my State Department colleagues when it does surface, but I don't have much to tell you on that, I'm afraid, at all today. With respect to moving money around, Chris, the current model is not completely inflexible. I don't want to suggest that it's all that. I mean, we are able to move money between those stovepipes to a degree now through reprogrammings, which of course go through the normal congressional the procedures for notification and discussion with the relevant committees and this kind of thing. It is not impossible to do. It's just an unwieldy process, and our hope is that we'll be able to move to a much more efficient place if we have a greater proportion of sort of regional funds that can be directed to country A or country B, to projects as circumstances seem to warrant, or even a global fund, which we're working to augment as well, so that we can make sure that as we look at this sort of threat matrix that I referred to earlier, and identify the particular, the most acute unmet needs, we'll be able to direct programming as smoothly and efficiently to that as possible. So it's not impossible to move that. We can do a lot of what we are doing, some of what we're doing internally. Some of it is part of the iterated relationship between the department and Congress as we move forward, and part of it is an internal state thing that we're working with the F shop, as I mentioned, on trying to do. I don't know, Kate, I don't know if I've missed anything there. Did you want to any detail that I'm missing? Okay. Okay, excellent. With respect to verification in DPRK or elsewhere, absolutely critical that these things be verified. I think across the board, U.S. statements on this have been absolutely unequivocal from the start. That whatever is implemented, of course, we need to be sure that it actually happens, and that we have gotten what we need to get in order to make sure that the threat programs have been eliminated pursuant to whatever the negotiated deal is. Now, until we know what the negotiated deal is, it's a little hard to tell precisely what it is one is verifying. But verification has always been an integral part of this. And indeed, from the design, as you're probably aware, Secretary Pompeo a couple of months ago set up a working group specifically to support his negotiations in North Korea. That working group draws upon expertise across the entire State Department, both in the diplomatic and regional side and in the sort of what we call the T family side, and that is to say the folks like my bureau that report to the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, who's known as T for reasons that I've never fully understood. it's easy to remember, maybe, I don't know. But T-family expertise is integral to this working group. It draws upon ISN staffers. It draws upon staffers from the Arms Control Verification and Compliance Bureau, and verification planning for for whatever it is negotiated in North Korea has been a piece of that mandate all along. And so don't think anyone's forgotten it. It is absolutely not forgotten. Secretary Pompeo and the President, I think, have also made it very clear publicly and to the North Koreans that we imagine that there will be an important role for the IAEA in North Korea. What precisely that role is not knowable unless and until there's a negotiated deal. So, of course, it's hard to speculate about right now. But I do know that the agency out in Vienna has been doing its own series of scenario plannings to be prepared for whatever it is that may come down the block, as indeed we are doing in the U.S. interagency to make sure that we're prepared to implement whatever it is that we may be told to implement in the North Korean context. But I can assure you that verification is and has always been absolutely essential to that planning. As for anticipating the needs of partner countries, we certainly do try to do that. I mean, the principal focus is upon what we think the needs are, and to the degree that, just because they think they have needs is not necessarily going to be a driver here. We will be looking at this from the perspective, as I indicated, with the threat prioritized matrix of looking at individual countries and the particular circumstances they're in, the degree to which they may, for instance, set aside some particularly important international trade route or smuggling route, or be adjacent to a country that's falling apart and from which there's a lot of sort of walkabout activity of dangerous materials or weapons. All those factors are part of the calculation. So we certainly try to look very systematically at what the needs are, and we look at it from the perspective of what the needs, through the prism of our own national security needs and the importance of supporting international security against the kind of problems that would be attendant if those things were unaddressed. But that is absolutely part of the process that we're building. And as I indicated, although we do this internally amongst the XBIS partners right now, for instance, with the 67 or so that there are, we are in the process of, with some help from the Sandia, building out that threat understanding so that we can use this not just in terms of how we rack and stack things internally between existing programs, but how we can use this as a better tool to address potential future programs as well. So at the end of the day, the objective is to be able to say to anyone who asks us up the chain, sideways, in the media, in public, or on the Hill, that we have done everything it is possible to do to make sure that we are using this money as effectively as possible against the most important threats to the national security of the American people and the interests of international security more broadly.
Very good. Terry, we'll go to the back, and then Ambassador Brill here. Sorry, he just come right around here. The gentleman with his hand up, and this fellow as well.
Thank you very much for your remarks. My question is to ask you, what are the top concerns regarding the risks that might arise from global developments in science and technology, as well as developments in global commerce, that really concern you and will have a bearing on your priorities now and in the immediate future? Thank you very much.
Hannah, may I press you into service?
Sir.
I'm sorry. And then, thank you.
Hey, Chris.
You're standing in the wrong place, Hannah.
Your vision for a legacy, I think, is both ambitious but also very practical and actually possible. The newly amended Convention of the Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials, which entered into force very recently, people are beginning to think about the review process that's referred to in the document. The original CPPNM had one review in the course of some 20 years. If you look around at the nuclear safety world, you'll see there's a model that really works quite well in terms of a review process where states get together, compare notes, and make adjustments and commit themselves to taking action. And if you look over in the environmental area at the ozone treaties, the same thing happens. States get together, compare notes, assess each other's work, and make commitments and take action. That's lacking in nuclear security. And to the extent that the administration exercises leadership in working with a number of like-minded states, there are states who are opposed to having any kind of review process associated with the CPPNM. You might imagine who some of them are. But having a robust review process through the CPPNM would help you very much with your legacy goal. I wondered if much thought is being given in ISN to that, and if not, if the NGO community could give you guys some ideas.
Let me add one more to that, if I may, Chris. as you talk about the threat writ large, vis-a-vis the programs that you oversee now at the State Department, as we look back in time, again, it's kind of in the early days of the post-Cold War era, it was a big infrastructure problem, right? They were tangible facilities. It's a big chemical weapons facility that has to be demobilized. Today, that threat has presumably shifted quite dramatically to one that is much less tangible. It's much more intangible. It's technology. It's know-how. How is the review that you are overseeing, considering that threat, managing that threat, and retooling for the future?
Great questions all. In terms of developments in science and technology, in how we try to keep a very practical focus upon how we approach challenges of, for example, emerging technologies. There is important work to be done, and people are doing it and thinking sort of in the broader, longer-term issue about what areas of technology are going to be sort of the big disruptors for a generation from now, and of course we have to keep our eye on that. But because we are ultimately, in this respect, very practical people, we think in terms of okay, so how would you build a regulatory regime to help alleviate these dangers? There are some things that are just still, potentially of amazing world historical impact, for good or for ill, but that are really hard in the present day to sort of get your hands around, and not literally necessarily, but how would you define the problem from the perspective of a regulatory regime designed to control the spread, the transfers, or to provide a licensing check upon transfers of technology, for example? There are some things that are really amorphous and hard to think about in that context. We're as interested in anybody in things like artificial intelligence, but how do you talk about artificial intelligence? That could include 500 different things, not all of which, and maybe none of which, are fully fledged in a way that would be, or it's harder to identify particular points of traction from the perspective of actually helping someone with capacity building in a partner country, or even making recommendations to our own export control process. We try to be a little bit more practical than our realm is in the middle zone. We definitely need to be doing more than just thinking about how to implement all the current understandings of what controlled goods are more effectively. Of course, we do that too. But in terms of emerging technologies, we have to be looking a step ahead, but not 10 steps ahead. Because if you get that far out, it becomes very hard to figure out what it is you're actually talking about with the degree of practical traction that we need to do things like export control and trainings of practical folks who are in the business of creating proliferation barriers. So we're trying to find that sort of middle spot in terms of things being developed enough to know that they are worrisome and potential disruptors, but not so far out down the line that it is really hard to know what to do with them. This is something we do on an ongoing day-to-day basis. There is a process by which, as we refine our thinking on this, we reach out to multilateral control regimes, such as the Wassenaar Arrangement, for example, to encourage partners and have debates with people about, as everyone is doing this to some degree at the same time, have debates about what the right answers are. To the degree that we reach agreement on these things, we try to make sure that control lists are periodically updated. We do this inside the U.S. system as well. There are lots of debates always currently underway about how it is to handle particular types of emerging technology threats. It's a subject of day-to-day attention, and given that the tech world is doing all the things that the tech world is doing, you can imagine it takes a lot of time and effort, but it's important. But I don't have a laundry list of, here's my greatest 3 at this point. We're actually in the middle of scrubbing through some of these questions right now from the perspective of trying to be more attentive to emerging technology threats in this space, but I don't have any good answers for you today. But rest assured, it is something that we're painfully aware of the importance of it, but also of not being too pie in the sky down the road. It's important to find that middle zone where it's possible to be practical as well as to be out in front of the current curve. CPPNM, good point. Absolutely. Review conference coming up. I believe it's mandated that there's a review conference, and there's some open questions about what we do thereafter.
Or even how you prepare for it.
Or even how to even structure the first one. Quite correct. Under active consideration, it's a great question, and I'd actually be happy to learn more about what smart folks out there in the NGO community think should be done. We are trying to think this through as well, so it would be a great engagement, and we are looking for ways to do that kind of institutionalization piece in a broad sense, and happy to exchange views on what the right answers are there. I just came from my first meeting back in Vienna last week of something called the Nuclear Security Contract Group, which is another piece of this institutionalization puzzle. You will, of course, recall that 4 national security summits. But even at the end of the Obama administration, they were transitioning to more of a sustainment model with high-level political engagement to try to keep this moving forward, but not the head of government, not the sort of the episodic head of government level thing. It was a way to institutionalize exactly the kind of movement towards normalcy, a new normal of best practices that I was talking about before. And what it represents is a number of countries who had key roles in the nuclear security summit process getting together on a periodic basis to continue the diplomatic engagements that are necessary to help bring this institutionalization forward. The objective was to have it not be down at the weedy level, but to be at, neither at the head of state level nor the weedy level, but at a level roughly equivalent to mine, at which we can sort of function as the connective tissue between the really high-level political and policy community and the folks who actually implement things in a real-world basis. And our hope is that through that kind of engagement, we can sustain the attention from our diplomatic partners across in this case, the nuclear security field, that will help make it possible to build to that new normal as we go forward. It's my first encounter with it. It is a transition that we've done inside the U.S. government now, from the NSC-led process to a State Department-led process, precisely on the theory that, the State Department provides the bureaucratic support and the institutional memory and the staffing that we think will be necessary to help to do that institution building and normalization of best practices as we go forward. So although, of course, we're working closely with our NSC colleagues on this, this is a process that was previously chaired by NSC. We did this out of my directorate last year at the NSC, but now we're transitioning to my bureau at State, and we're looking forward to continuing to work on these issues in many of the ways you're describing, and look forward to talking further about this stuff. So, I probably forgot somebody, but that's probably all I can think of right now.
You've forgotten me, Chris, so I'm going to remind you.
I didn't pull you off the stage.
I have a microphone attached to me. So.
The changing threat perception, the move from kind of tangible, very tangible threats to a much more amorphous, intangible challenge that you're trying to get your arms around.
Challenges across the realm of what I think was T family bureaus. I mean, certainly what you're describing, and there's been a long time understanding that the shifting technologies of, in the old days you would build a sort of Soviet-style chemical weapons plant to provide enough material for your giant artillery corps. These days, even if you wish to do that, and it's not clear, the models under which people wish to use things, I mean, are not necessarily World War III. I mean, what we see the Syrian regime doing in the Assad regime doing in Syria, for instance, is not that kind of massive industrial scale, but it's certainly formidable and problematic plenty as it is. But those modes have changed somewhat. But also, what you would do these days with modern technology, I assume you would have, you are more likely to see things in the future where it would be a sort of a normal industrial process that factories are very good at producing all kinds of exotic chemicals, and you simply change the configurations and the programmings, and you change what you put in the front end, and what comes out the back end is different. It's not necessarily the same kind of purpose-built thing that you have. And that's not even counting modern advanced microfluidics and all the kind of like really crazy stuff that one can do in the cutting edge these days that the commercial sector is moving into with great abandon. You see worries about the size and the signature of these kinds of capabilities that are very important from a verification perspective, and they're also very important from a sort of technology control perspective. The difference between sort of military specific and kind of the COTS world in all of these areas. Biotechnology is sort of the paradigmatic case, and even in the early 2000s, it was clear enough that a verification protocol under the BWC was going to be just unachievable. These are huge challenges to us, and there aren't any magic answers to how to deal with them. I like to think that they're actually they're straining, or that they will provide strain over time, I suspect, on intelligence collection capabilities, on verification and compliance assessment capabilities. Those aren't my lanes on the road in the department, but clearly technology is changing, and keeping a handle on that is going to be an ongoing challenge. It was that way when I was in the verification and compliance business 10 or 15 years ago, and I can only assume it's gotten much worse. From a technology control perspective, these are also enormously formidable problems. As the civilian and the military worlds sort of increasingly interpenetrate and mutually entangle, we may have to do some very serious thinking about how to address this. I do think that part of this comes down in at least a partial answer, not a terribly comprehensive one, but part of the answer to the problem presumably has to be the creation of a better understanding of these challenges in the broader community. The idea that this is not something that can be left to bureaucrats. Oh, I'm an industrial producer of this and that and so forth, and I don't need to worry about anything that the Commerce Department, unless the Commerce Department tells me that I can't export this, everything's fine. We got to get past that mindset that security is something that bureaucrats just sort of take care of. Security needs to be something that we all take care of because it's our collective responsibility. And in areas where the technologies are so deeply intertwined like this, I don't see any way forward that doesn't involve sensitizing a much broader range, whether it's in the research community, the industrial sector, and Lord knows where else. We all need to be thinking about the potential dangers of these technologies on a more, and you know your own stuff. If I produce something or other, I may actually have a much better idea of all the terrible things one could do with it than the average licensing official, although we're trying to make sure that they're very, very good. So I think part of this is actually just to sensitize folks to the fact that these are challenges and they're important. Because if you don't have, that's not a complete answer, but I think if you don't have that kind of security culture, you got nothing.
Yep, well phrased. Let's do a front row thing here. We'll go to this right in the front, up here, and then we'll come here, and we will do. Of course, please jump in.
Oh, this is where people with real expertise save Chris.
Could you, that lady right there, yeah, thank you.
Kate Inslee, export at the ECC office.
Kate Inslee, I'm the director of the XVIS program at State. I work for Chris. I just wanted to use that set of questions to make a plug for a conference that we're hosting November 5th and 6th at the Mayflower Hotel. It's our implementers conference for ISN. So it's all of our current, past, and potential implementing partners, interagency, international, NGOs, private sector. One of the things that we'll be talking about is what are these threats that we need to be thinking about, present threats, future threats, what are the technologies, what are the changes in commerce, where should we be targeting our programs to be most effective. We'll tell you what we think and where we're going, but we also want it to be a dialogue where we can hear from people with expertise that we don't have sitting where we sit. So I just couldn't resist the opportunity to make that plug and hope to see some of you there in November. Thanks.
Kate, that is an open event on November 5th and 6th. We will put a link to whatever eventually comes our way at the bottom of this event page to send more information. Lovely Umaya.
Hi, my name is Lovely Umaya. I'm an analyst here at the Stimson Center. So there are other political flashpoints around the world, let's say the imposition of tariffs, for example, that really affect our relationships with potential partners that could potentially make the unaware or unable to become the unwilling, right? So how do you grapple with other policy factors affecting your ideal non-proliferation approach?
Thank you, Lila. We're going to do one more Chris here.
Hi, Chris. Diane Perlman, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason High. So in continuation of a conversation we've been having over the years, well, first I'd like to invoke Teddy Roosevelt, talk softly and carry a big stick. And everyone knows we have a big stick, so I think what made a quantum leap with North Korea was Trump responding to his invitation and treating him with respect and sort of going from being a pariah to being a captain of the football team the next day and going around the world and being more open. So I think he can't go back to that. And also what helped us resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis was help finding a graceful face-saving way out and avoiding humiliation. So, and maximum pressure sometimes has the opposite effect. And
right along to
okay. So anyway, I just wanted to ask you about what about also like tension reduction, dealing with the underlying conflict, not just the symptoms of the weapons, but the causes, and also with Iran, like this increases hardliners, and in 10 years, younger people who don't want to be pariahs could come more. The dynamics could shift.
Thank you.
There over the years.
Thank you. Let's do. I don't have to answer these questions. Now let's do one more. Huh? You try to keep them. So let's do this lady right here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary. My name is Valeria Lozova. I'm a Fulbright visiting researcher at Center for Nonproliferation Studies. And my question is about Iran. You said that you hope that Iran makes the right choice. And what is your view of why they should and could do that, meaning what can motivate or coerce them into accepting stricter terms? And what requirements are seen as absolutely unconditional from the administration standpoint? Thank you.
Softballs.
Other flashpoints. I won't say that the other flashpoints can't affect the work that we do, because of course I'm sure they could. I also don't know what our work currently would be like if not for those flashpoints. So it's hard to, this is, I was always happy that my undergraduate institution called it a government rather than political science, because there's a limited degree of science in all of this. We don't have control sets. We can't rewind it and run it again by changing the variables. What we do know is, or at least my impression so far has been, that it is actually in some ways surprising the degree to which some of the external swirling around in the international community doesn't. It's a remarkable degree to which it doesn't affect what we do. I think countries are surprisingly willing to compartmentalize this. Not invariably the case, of course, but I've been pleased by the degree to which it is. So I think, in part for some of the same reasons, maybe by analogy that I was describing earlier, certainly in the U.S. system, these are issues that have gotten sustained importance and bipartisan support over a long period of time, while many other, flashpoints in our domestic discourse over foreign policy issues have come and gone. I think maybe other countries are perhaps also of a mind that this is actually really important, and we're not coming there to usually not coming there to cause trouble for them. We're often offering help. So look, we understand that countries have an interest in controlling their borders, whether it is for maximization of customs revenue, or whether it is to prevent WMD from being trafficked, or to keep weapons from being supplied to domestic terrorist groups, or to be supplied to others from domestic terrorist groups that could bring all sorts of trouble onto someone. I mean, I think partner countries often share in profound ways, in very different ways, depending upon the circumstances, an interest in doing these things right. And when we come offering help and assistance and encouragement, it's often very well received, even when the rest of the world, even when you would think from the morning headlines that things might be much more problematic than they are. That's not a cure-all, but I think you'd be surprised how well it works despite some of those flashpoints. So, is that a guarantee that nothing will ever affect? No, of course not. But so far, I've been pretty pleased. Dan, you mentioned issues of trying to treat the sort of underlying challenges rather than just the symptoms. I think that may have been some of your phrasing. And I would say actually that is a point of which we are very aware, and indeed we've made it an explicit part of our own approach to issues such as nuclear disarmament, where we've been it was last spring, I myself wheeled out a new initiative that we've been percolating on all of last year in trying to think through how it is to approach, what is our policy with respect to issues of disarmament that have been such an important part of international discourse for so many years. And one of the things that we're focusing on very much is this question of the underlying conditions. And I think you see a bit of a clue to that. If you pick up the NPT, for example, you have a clue to some really important wisdom there in the preamble, where it talks about the importance of, I think the phrasing is, easing of tension and strengthening trust between states in order to facilitate disarmament. I think there's a real lesson there that I fear we may perhaps have forgotten for a little while. We had the luxury of forgetting it for a little while, because at the end of the Cold War, we ended up with a giant surplusage of weapons that we did not need, because the underlying strategic circumstances of our rivalry with Moscow had changed. And because we didn't need them, we were able, over the succeeding generation, to spend down those, to dismantle enormous numbers of weapons and to use arms control as a tool to bring numbers down very successfully. But there's a limit to how far you can go with that if you haven't addressed underlying conditions. And we took advantage of the changes at the end of the Cold War in those conditions to make all of that disarmament that we've done so far possible. And I want to stress what an important degree of movement that has been. I believe the figure is now something on the order of 88% of the arsenal that we had at the peak period of Cold War holding. We are now down to that residual 12% or something, right? So this is a huge, huge thing. But it was only possible because the conditions changed, right? We didn't get the end of the Cold War because we got rid of 88% of our weapons. It was the other way around. And we need to take that lesson as we move forward. And if people were to think seriously about how to have a world in which disarmament of the sort envisioned by so many in the international community is actually an increasingly feasible choice for real-world possessors of nuclear weapons, we've got to do more to address the conditions in which people interact in this world. It's not just a question of waving around some miraculous treaty that someone thinks is going to solve the problem by virtue of the fact that it has words printed on paper and signatures at the bottom. That's not how this works. How it can work, if it is to work, is for us to get together across the range of states. The Article 6 of the NPT talks about each state has an obligation to pursue negotiations in good faith. It doesn't say just the weapon states. It doesn't say just this state or just that state. It says each state. All of us have a responsibility to move this forward, and I think the only sensible and intelligible way to try to do this is to look to how it is that we can make the conditions of the world that drives some states to want to get weapons and drives other states to conclude that they cannot get rid of theirs yet. We have to work on those conditions. If we can't do that, there's no hope of going forward, no matter how many fancy treaties you can wave around in international fora. But we do think that that is a really important insight. And we're trying to make that a part of our diplomacy to build a better approach to developing answers to that challenge of changing the conditions of the world. Is that going to happen soon? No. Is it going to happen at all? I don't know. But I am pretty confident that the only way it's going to happen is through some kind of really significant change in the underlying conditions of how it is that nations relate to each other. And if we can be focused on trying to figure out a way to build that, we have the only conceivable way forward on disarmament. But I think the conventional wisdom has gotten it rather wrong, and we tried to make that very clear earlier this year, and we're looking forward to doing much more with our partners as we go forward. And very finally, how to motivate the Iranians. Well, we think one of the things that we're doing right now is is precisely in order to motivate the Iranian regime to make better decisions. We are, of course, reapplying pressure. We are across a range of issues. We are, of course, rather famously, we've already had one tranche of sanctions come back in on a range of commodities and issues. The bigger tranche is coming in November, at which point oil sanctions will kick back in. But as I stressed before, this is not being done just because we're jerks. It's being done because we want to drive towards a real negotiated solution of the sort that Secretary Pompeo referred to. That's not necessarily going to be an easy or a quick road, but it is something we think is absolutely essential to do. The Iranian regime is clearly, transparently unmotivated to talk about this at this point. They've made a great show this week in particular, rejecting any idea of sitting down to talk with us about these things. But then again, we didn't expect them to come around that quickly. What we think we'll have to do is to mount what is in effect a maximum pressure campaign on Iran across a variety of fronts. We have a lot of partner support on working with them, working against them, I should say, in this respect, in the issue of missiles and terrorism and regional destabilization. And I think we can build support in the nuclear field as well. And that if and when we do that, it'll be possible to actually have the kind of negotiation that I referred to earlier. You asked about which of the items that Secretary Pompeo mentioned are the must-haves. Well, for present purposes, they are all must-haves. We want to get this negotiation started, and I can't swear to you exactly where it will lead, but we think it is absolutely essential for that discussion to begin, because we don't think that there's any answer for a stable Middle East or one in which the interests that we all hold so dear are protected there, unless and until Iran's capabilities to pursue, unless it is denied all available, all potential pathways to a nuclear weapon, unless its missile activities are brought in some way under control, unless it stops its current path of supporting terrorism and destabilizing its neighbors. That sounds like a long list when you read Secretary Pompeo's 12 things, but it's actually not that long. It's really only one thing, and that is behave like a normal country. And in return for that, we have said very clearly that we are willing to treat Iran like a normal country. The Secretary of State has talked about normalization of relations, the restoration of diplomatic ties, reintegration into the international economic community, assistance with provision of appropriate advanced technology. That is what normal countries do with each other. And we would be delighted to have that engagement with Iran. And frankly, all it has to do is act normal in order to be treated normally. But until it continues, as long as it continues acting like a malign, destabilizing influence in a number of different ways simultaneously, we're going to have to treat it as such. And if it likes the way that we treat it as a result of those behaviors, I suppose we'll be in this standoff for a long time. But we're hoping we can convince them that the best interests of the regime, the best interests of the Iranian people, most of all, are served by coming to that place with us and finding the answer that Secretary Pompeo outlined.
Chris, if I do not have you out of here in 7 minutes, Julia Krzyzanski will put me in a headlock. But don't get up yet. I thought maybe...
I actually think that would be enormously entertaining. So do you mind if I just sit here
I
for a bit?
do not
want to
see that. Maybe the only one in the room that doesn't want to see that. But if we could do, we'll just go right here. 2 rapid-fire questions, maybe here, and then here as well.
Hi, Dan Horner. Chris, in your remarks, you mentioned moving to resources to countries that were greater threats and away from ones that were less. Then you subsequently talked about the 3 categories of countries, the unaware, unable, and unwilling. How do those 2 mesh? Like, what do you do in a situation when you have a country that's a threat but it's unwilling? How do you what does your model and approach imply in that kind of case? Thanks.
My name is Marina Robinson Snowden. I'm a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My question is more about the practical vision coming out of the talks with North Korea about their nuclear activities. What do you see, or do you have any insights with respect to what the preferences of the administration, whether it's a treaty or an agreement? And I ask because I'm interested in what you see as potential domestic politics obstacles to the ratification of a treaty, if that is what is the preference.
Actually, let me squeeze one more in here. Thank you. There you go, ma'am.
Thank you, Chris. Katie Wang with NTT TV. My question is about China, because on either North Korea issue or Iran, China always play a big role on that. So how's your cooperation with China, and what challenges are you facing? And also, tomorrow, President Trump will speak at the UN Security Council on nonproliferation. Do you have any preview that you can share with us? Thank you so much.
Very good. Thank you.
Let's see where to start. Countries that are a threat but unwilling. That's a slightly different, to the degree that our nonproliferation programming is involved in those kinds of cases, it is not, of course, likely to be with the country itself for the most part. It may be with their neighbors to make sure that to the degree that they are a problem or they are unwilling, that their problem is contained. It may be a question of securing the borders around that state to make sure that they're not contributing to the problem any more than necessary. It may be working with folks at Treasury or through State Department sanctions authorities to put pressure on them. If the unwillingness goes to things such as not enforcing Security Council resolutions against North Korea, for instance, then there can be real consequences to that. So it's going to depend. But the engagement is, of course, less congenial and cooperative when they're in the threat but unwilling business. I suppose that goes without saying. But there are also countries, and this is also attendant to the logical result of our sort of threat prioritization thing. There may be countries that are unwilling and or unaware, but not a threat. And to the degree that that is the case too, they are not likely to be very high on our prioritization list. What we're trying to do is figure out where the sweet spot is between places where we can make a difference with our programming, where there are significant threats. The purpose is not engagement for its own sake. And so we are trying to threat prioritize things as well. And it's a slightly different question than which bin of those that they fall into, except for the threat piece. And our hope is that for every country that we think is a threat, there is some kind of an effort underway. It's going to be a different answer depending upon the cases in question. But as to the DPRK treaty versus agreement or whatever else, I don't believe we've said anything publicly on that at this point, and I don't think I'm going to move the ball forward here today. My apologies. I believe we have said, I think the new Iran coordinator at the State Department, Brian Hook, has made reference to the desirability, hopefully, of a treaty with respect to Iran. There, of course, is a lot of backstory on that. As you will have been following this for some years, the controversy over the choice of an executive agreement model for the JCPOA in a way that denied the opportunity for congressional buy-in. There were efforts, of course, on the Hill, and I say this as a former Foreign Relations Committee staffer. There were efforts in Capitol Hill through legislative mechanisms to set up at least a sort of modicum of a review process as a second best because treaty ratification wasn't available. That was ended up being defeated at the end of the day by a filibuster by Harry Reid. So there is some history and baggage, if you will, to the question of in what form do these agreements get made. I don't think we have any pronouncement on the North Korea piece, but I believe we have indicated that this bigger, better deal we would like to get with the Iranians, it is indeed our hope that would be something that would both be presented for and would obtain Senate support. And I would suggest that there's also value in that, even from the Iranian perspective, insofar as if it's a legally binding agreement ratified by the Senate, it is rather more difficult to walk away from or to change thereafter than an executive agreement. So to the degree that they're upset at us for the JCPOA, they should be happy to have this in a treaty form, and we encourage them to work with us on that very point. As for China and the DPRK and a preview of discussions, I don't have much to add there. I'm sorry to punt on that, but I'd best leave folks to speak for themselves, and I will leave the delicacies of diplomacy vis-a-vis China and North Korea to others for present purposes. Sorry.
So, Chris, you have a very difficult job, and we're really grateful to you for taking time out.
I have a fantastically fun job with great people working for me, doing important things. And as I tell them, we really, I mean, it sounds sort of like corny, but we're about saving the world. And that's a pretty damn cool thing to be working on all day long.
Well, you are welcome
into the night.
You are welcome on this stage at any time, and really grateful to you for making the time to.
It's a pleasure.